Mike, I guess you're up first.
Good evening. It's great to be with you this evening. Can you all hear me? Is mic on? Hello? There we go. Good evening. It's great to be with you, and I'd like to thank Regent University for hosting tonight's debate. I would also like to thank Mr. Shabir Ally and his organization for inviting me to debate him. Mr. Ally is certainly a very experienced debater and is perhaps, certainly, one of the most articulate ambassadors of Islam today. So in light of this, I think we're in for an enjoyable time this evening as we explore the evidence for an answer to the question, did Jesus rise from the dead? Now, for me, this is one of the most interesting as well as important topics for discussion. And let me explain why. About 20 years ago, I was in graduate school specializing in the study of New Testament Greek and planning on going into the ministry. And at that time, I believed that I had a very intimate relationship with God. But I started to wonder, is this really the truth? Or was I self-deluded? So I decided to take a step back from my position of confidence and to ask some of the tough questions. And when I did that, I was just praying, God, lead me. And I started to look at all the evidence for Christianity and considering the evidence for the other religions and also considering the arguments for atheism. And after several years, the personal conclusion that I came to was that what I had initially believed had been revealed to me by God's Holy Spirit had now been confirmed from and by philosophy, science, and history. Namely, that God exists and that he has actually revealed himself to mankind in Jesus Christ and that Christianity is true. The evidence for Jesus' resurrection at that point was strongly compelling to me and largely led me to that decision. Now, the reason Jesus' resurrection is so important is because the truth of Christianity hinges on this event. Jesus' atoning death and resurrection have been bedrock doctrines for Christianity since its inception. Therefore, if Jesus did not rise from the dead, the foundation collapses and Christianity is false. The Apostle Paul himself wrote, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless." On the other hand, if Jesus did rise from the dead, then it seems that there's good reason for believing that Christianity is true. And that gives us something we're all going to have to think about. You see, I don't think it's sufficient to say, well, the evidence is good for resurrection, but I just can't believe it because my worldview doesn't allow it. Well, if that's a position you find yourself in, it may be time to find another worldview. That's why this evening's debate is much, much more than an academic discussion. The eternal destiny of our souls may very well hinge on what we do with Jesus and his resurrection. So where do we begin? Historical Jesus research. The eminent historical Jesus scholar, John Meyer, explains it as follows. He says, suppose we have a Jew, an agnostic, and a Christian. This is not a joke. A Jew, an agnostic, and a Christian, all honest historians, all well acquainted with first century religious movements. And we lock them up at Harvard Divinity School Library and we tell them you can't come out until you have hammered out a consensus statement on what we can know about Jesus based on historical research only and apart from any faith or theological considerations. That resulting document would portray what scholars refer to as the historical Jesus. Now, the real Jesus, the Jesus who walked the shores of the Sea of Galilee, may have been much, much more than the Jesus portrayed in that document, but he's nothing less. So obviously tonight, I am not going to be presenting an argument that says, the Bible says it, I believe it, and that settles it for me. It's more rather like what Tom Cruise said in the movie A Few Good Men. It doesn't matter what I believe, it only matters what I can prove. Now, with this in mind, what I want to do this evening is I want to present 3 facts for you that are strongly evidenced and are granted by a large majority, if not virtually every scholar who studies the subject, even the rather skeptical ones. Fact number 1 is Jesus' death by crucifixion. That Jesus was crucified and died through the process is granted by virtually 100% of all scholars who study the subject today. His crucifixion, his death by crucifixion, is attested not only in Christian sources, but in non-Christian sources as well. Now, crucifixion and the tortures that preceded it was an unspeakably cruel process. Many of us have watched Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion, and we've witnessed the brutal process of scourging used by the Romans in antiquity. Now, this is also described in other ancient writings. For example, Josephus reports of a man who was filleted to the bone with whips. In a 2nd century document called the Martyrdom of Polycarp, he mentions how the Roman whip could expose both veins and arteries. Now, the Jewish authorities had a law, and it was that when scourging a person, you could not give them more than 39 lashes. But the Romans had no such law. They could scourge a person with as many lashes as they wanted. In fact, they could scourge a person to death. Now, once this brutal process, this torture was done, then the victim was forced to carry a crossbeam out, and he was led outside the city gates. When he was they took nails and they impaled him to a cross or to a tree. And then the victim was left there, exposed to the elements and to scavengers such as birds, dogs, and annoying insects. It was a horrible, humiliating, and painful death. In fact, the word excruciating comes out of the cross. In the 1st century, there was an author named Seneca, and he described a person on the cross as appearing sickly, deformed, and swollen with ugly welts on shoulders and chest. Likewise, Josephus in the 1st century referred to crucifixion as the most wretched of deaths. Now, in light of this process, the majority of the medical community today has come with a near unanimous decision that Jesus died as a result of being crucified. Now, scholars, or I should say medical professionals, differ on the actual cause of crucifixion. Nevertheless, they are still very much convinced that Jesus certainly died as a result. So, let's sum up our evidence for Jesus' death by crucifixion. First, it's multiply attested by even non-Christian sources. Second, our understanding of crucifixion and the tortures that preceded it militate against a person surviving the cross. And third is we look and we find that there's the universal professional medical opinion that Jesus died as a result. So we can see that the evidence, both historical and medical, indicates that Jesus was crucified and that this process killed him. Fact number 2, the empty tomb. An impressive 75% of all scholars who study the subject acknowledge this. Now, tonight I want to give you 3 arguments for the empty tomb. The first is the Jerusalem factor. Now, Jesus was publicly executed, then buried, and then his resurrection first proclaimed, all in Jerusalem. Now, it would have been impossible for Christianity to get off the ground in that city if the body had still been in the tomb. Why all the Jewish or Roman authorities would have had to do is go to the tomb, exhume the body, tie his heels together, and drag him through Main Street in Jerusalem, and the hoax was over. But that did not happen. In fact, that leads us to our second argument for the empty tomb, and that is what the enemies of Jesus were saying. They were saying that the disciples stole the body. Now, I have a 9-year-old son, and let's suppose that he goes in tomorrow or Monday and he tells his 4th grade teacher that the dog ate his homework. Now, that indicates to the teacher he doesn't have it to turn in. And likewise, when the disciples or the Jewish leadership was saying that the disciples stole the body, this indicates that they couldn't produce it. Leads us through our third argument for the empty tomb, and that is the concept of resurrection. Whoop. Wow. Okay, that doesn't like me. Oh well. Let me go back. The concept of resurrection in antiquity was that it was a bodily event. And, sorry about this. Yeah, I missed it. Anyway, we'll move on. The concept of bodily resurrection in antiquity was that it was a bodily event. It actually happened to the body. Now, here's what happens. N.T. Wright, he's a very eminent New Testament historian, and he just did a book last year called The Resurrection of the Son of God. And in this 800-page volume, Wright devoted the bulk of the work to analyzing what was going on in antiquity in terms of what scholars or what the people in antiquity believed happened once a person died. Now, here's the deal. He found that the pagans, what they believed was that when a person died, they would shed the body and become a disembodied spirit. On the other hand, Jews had a couple of different views. There was a group of people who believed that there was no life after death. They were called the Sadducees. And when a person died, in their opinion, that's it. They just ceased to exist. There was no heaven for them. And so they were sad, you see. Now, on the other hand, most Jews believed in a bodily resurrection. In fact, the leading group was the Pharisees, and they believed that there was life after death. And they were fair, you see. Now, what they believed was the body that died was the body that was buried, and then on the day of resurrection, that body would be raised and transformed into an immortal body. Now, Jews and Christians aren't the only ones that believe in that resurrection is bodily. In fact, we can show up before the time of Jesus, during, and slightly after, it always meant a body. But the Islamic view of resurrection is that it's bodily as well. In the Quran, Surah 75, verses 1 through 4, it speaks that of Allah, when on the final day of resurrection, on the final day, the judgment day, that final day, God will reassemble bones and restore a person down to their very fingertips. So there's a common thread throughout Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that resurrection always involved the body. Now, it would seem then that if the disciples are saying that Jesus was resurrected, that involved the body, and of course it implies the empty tomb. Now, in light of that, we've seen some good evidence for the empty tomb this evening. William Wand of Oxford University sums it up this way. He says, all the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb. And those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other grounds than that of scientific history. So, where does this leave us? Number one, we've seen that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. Number two, we've seen the empty tomb. But wait, there's more. Fact number three, on a number of occasions we see that the disciples of Jesus believed that he had been resurrected and had appeared to them. And not only was this disciples, but it was the foes of Jesus as well. Let's deal with the first group, and that would have to do with the friends of Jesus, his disciples. This is testified by eyewitnesses who knew the disciples, namely Paul and Clement of Rome. These, again, they knew the disciples, and they were saying that the disciples were claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead. In addition, there is early oral tradition referred to as kerygma. It comes from the Greek word kerugma, which means the official and formal preaching of the disciples. And when we look at this, we find that the kerygma refers to resurrection. In fact, let me give you the primary example. It's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, in what scholars have identified as a creed. Now, in this creed, it says that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Then he appeared to Peter, then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 at one time, most of whom are still alive, but some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And then after that, Paul says he adds his own name to that list. Now, I wish I had time to get into how scholars and why they date this to within 5 years of the crucifixion and trace it to the disciples themselves. I don't have time, but if Mr. Ali would like to challenge this finding of the majority of scholars, I'd be happy to deal with it in the remainder of our debate this evening. In the meantime, we can conclude that the disciples were claiming that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. But we can go further. No less than 7 sources in antiquity attest that they were willing to suffer and die for those convictions that Jesus had been resurrected. Now, I'm not saying, and I want to be clear on this, I am not saying that this proves that Jesus rose. Because certainly people of other religious beliefs, and even non-religious beliefs like communism, they are willing to suffer and die for their convictions. However, we wouldn't accuse people who suffer and die for their convictions for dying for a known lie. And thus, we can show that the disciples were not only claiming that Jesus had been risen, but they really believed it. Liars make poor martyrs. That brings us to our second group of people, and that is the foes of Jesus. I want to look at right now one of the major foes, and that is Paul. Now, the record states that Paul was a persecutor of the church. He was arresting, beating, consenting to the deaths of Christians, and then he converted to one because he claimed that he experienced a post-resurrection appearance of Jesus, and it totally transformed his life. This testimony is documented not only by Paul himself, but confirmed by Acts, and also further corroborated by a very early oral tradition that said, "He who persecuted the church now promotes the faith he once sought to destroy." So we have both early, eyewitness, and multiple testimonies to this fact. Folks, this is the kind of data historians drool over. But we can go further because not only did Paul claim this, we can say he really believed it because 7 sources attest that he was willing to suffer and die for those convictions. We go to another foe, and that would be James. Now, this is going to be the only time this evening that as evidence for the resurrection, I'm going to appeal to the Gospels because I like data which is much earlier, and that way we can avoid discussions over the trustworthiness of the Gospels or the inerrancy of the New Testament. I want to go with facts that I can prove, and that's why I'm focusing on that. Nevertheless, historians still believe the testimony, the embarrassing testimony of the Gospels, that James, the brother of Jesus, as well as all of Jesus' brothers, were non-believers up through the time of his crucifixion. Then shortly afterward, we find James as a leader in the Church of Jerusalem. And then we find that 3 non-biblical sources, even a non-Christian source, says that James was willing to die, and did, for his beliefs that Jesus had been resurrected. What accounts for this transformation? Most scholars answer that by saying it's the appearance to James, and that it's reported in that early creed in 1 Corinthians 15 I mentioned a moment ago. Paula Fredrickson of Boston University comments, "I know in their own terms what they saw was the raised Jesus." That's what they say, and then all the historic evidence afterwards we have attest to that, the fact that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw. But I do know that as an historian, that they must have seen something. Let's go ahead and sum up our 3 facts then this evening. Number 1, Jesus' death by crucifixion. Number 2, the empty tomb. And number 3, the appearances to both friend and foe. At least that's what they believed had happened, that Jesus had been resurrected and had appeared to them. Let's go ahead and build a case now based on those 3 facts. We've seen that these facts are strongly evidenced historically and that they're granted by an impressive majority, if not virtually every scholar who studies the subject, including skeptical ones. We've also seen that Jesus' resurrection, we can see, easily explains all of these facts and without any strain. So in the absence of any plausible alternate theories to account for these facts, Jesus' resurrection can be accepted with confidence that it was an event that occurred. So now what Mr. Ally has to do this evening is he either has to show that the facts that I've presented, which are, again, strongly evidenced and attested or granted by virtually all scholars, that they're mistaken in this. Or he has to show that the logic of the argument that I have up here is flawed. Or he has to build a case of his own for what occurred that is at least as plausible, if not more so, than Jesus' resurrection. Until and unless he does this, I think the conclusion is sound. Jesus' resurrection is the best explanation for the historical data and should be regarded as a fact that occurred in history. Thank you.